All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Mexic-Arte lecture series. Today I have Dr. Vargas, who is our curator and director of programs, and he will be introducing Dr. David Maciel. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. And I'll let him take it away.
Bienvenidos. Welcome. My name is Dr. George Vargas, curator and director of programs at Mexic-Arte Museum in Austin, Texas. Today, we bring you the fifth and last lecture in our virtual lecture series dedicated to life and experiences in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, which examines the cultural history and social issues which artists have addressed living and working in the El Paso, Juarez, and U.S.-Mexico border region. In 2019, Mr. Juan Antonio Sandoval Jr. donated his wonderful collection of art and books to the museum. The current exhibition, Mexico, the Border and Beyond, features selections from the Juan Sandoval collection and is on view until August 22nd. A large part of the exhibition is life and experiences in the US-Mexico borderlands and is divided into 5 sections according to 5 themes. 5 scholars each will examine a theme. But before we continue, the museum wants to thank its sponsors and especially the National Endowment for the Humanities for the generous support of this program. We also invite our viewers at this time to submit questions and make comments, which we will address after David's presentation. Without further ado, Mexic-Arte Museum proudly presents Dr. David R. Maciel, who will lecture on La Cultura Sigue, La Frontera, the border as reflected in the cinematic lens. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of New Mexico and at the University of California in Los Angeles. His teaching and research interests include Chicano history, Latinos in the US, modern Mexico, modern Latin America, and the US-Mexico border, and the US Southwest. Between 2015 and 2019, he was a senior advisor for Mexico on all matters pertaining to the vote of Mexicans residing in the US in Mexico's elections. He has been a Fulbright professor in Mexico on 3 different occasions. He has served as media consultant in various films, such as Break of Dawn and The Bronze Screen. His published research has focused upon the history of the Chicano community and Mexican history and film. In addition, he has also published numerous articles and book chapters in scholarly journals from the United States, Mexico, and Spain. Currently, he's completing a co-edited book on essays of the golden age of Mexican cinema. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Dr. David R. Maciel. Take it away.
Buenos dias. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you guys. And I have to begin by acknowledging my deep appreciation for this invitation to the museum and particularly to Dr. George Vargas that I've known over many years, and I've learned a lot from his excellent work on Chicano art. So it's really a distinct pleasure for me to be here and share some thoughts with you about one of my all-time favorite subjects, which combines 2 of my personal and professional interests, the U.S.-Mexican border and film. And in that regard, let me begin by mentioning that, of course, we know that the film is one of the predominant um, cultural artifacts in today's culture. You know, most experts say that we are becoming a visual culture, that as years go by, we read less and watch more. And so films become exceedingly important, particularly now that they're on cable, that they're on DVs, that we have all kinds of different ways of portraying images visually by film and through television. And the border has been one of the leading subjects of the cinematic experience in both the United States and in Mexico, and from the 60s to the present in Chicano cinematic experiences. So let me begin by talking about each one of these cinematic trajectories and artifacts, and talk a little bit about some of the most representative and most important films within each of these three traditions. Let me begin with Hollywood and with American cinema. Uh, we can say actually, and curiously enough, that the border as a theme in American cinema concurred with the advent of American cinema. Even in the silent period, there were dozens and dozens of Westerns that were filmed dealing either with the border or situated on the border, both from a sort of very stereotypic manner in which, in Westerns, as you all recall, there always has to be heroes and villains. And in the first part of silent era films in Hollywood, the main villains were Mexicans. In fact, there was a slew of these what we call greaser films, in which there were hideous, stereotypes of Mexican origin bandits that were called greasers. And there were films such as Tony the Greaser, The Revenge of the Greaser, and on and on. So these films were very repetitive, very stereotypical, typical Western of the hero, usually Anglo-Saxon, cleaning up the border, wiping out the bandits, and making the border, a safe environment and place to be. One thing we have to remember about the border, it's always been viewed as sort of the last frontier, both in the United States and in Mexico. And this trend, or this idea of the border as the last frontier for civilization to sort of come in, has been a constant in both cinematic traditions of the United States, of American cinema, and of Mexican cinema. The first highlight American film that I would like to mention is Border Town. The reason that I say that it's the first major film, it's Warner Brothers, a major studio by then. It's a 1933 film, and it stars two Oscar winners. So this is not, a secondary film in any way. It's not a B film, what's called, but it has, star power. And the reason that it's entitled Border Town, it takes place in Los Angeles and in the San Diego Tijuana border. And it deals with a Mexican American character, which is a first for Hollywood to have a protagonist be a Mexican American and not be a secondary character, played by Paul Muni, who goes to law school. And in his first trial, he loses his temper, fights with the opposing lawyer, and is disbarred. And in his, sort of anger, turns to a life of a bouncer and crime in this sort of risky cafe in the border, and that's where the title of the film takes place. And this is important because, again, it's a 1935 film, and it has a major productions, and it sort of begins the trend of major production films with mainstream actors, but situated on the border and highlighting certain aspects of the border experience. Um, Again, continuing on, but seeing that this trend continues, we have a next film, which is actually, I would say, still today remaining one of the very few and very best Hollywood films done on the border. It's Border Incident, directed by Anthony Mann, a very respected director, who directed later on El Cid, many westerns, 7 with James Stewart, um, and one of the most uh, acclaimed directors in the 40s and 50s. Anyway, Border Incident is filmed entirely on the border, and that's what also gives it great authenticity. It's in the border of Calexico and Yuma, and it deals with the fact that this is a period of the Bracero Agreement, this agreement of temporary workers between Mexico and the United States to fill the labor gaps that World War II left behind. And the film deals with a gang that's stealing from these braceros, these Mexican workers, and even assassinating some of them for their monies. And so Ricardo Montalban, this is his first major film in the United States. Later on, as we remember, he had quite a distinguished career in the United States. But prior to that, he had already established himself as a major star in Mexican cinema. He plays the protagonist, and he plays a Mexican agent that, in conjunction with an American agent, his counterpart, deal with breaking up this gang of criminals on the border. But it captures the border experience quite well. It's excellent direction, excellent acting, and a very excellent script. So I highly would recommend to any of you that are interested in border cinema to check it out and watch it. It is one of the very best of Hollywood films on the border. The next film, the next illustration that I wanted to mention is Border River, which is a typical Western, but situated on the border, with a Mexican icon of an actor, Pedro Armendáriz, who worked both in Mexican films and in American films. He was truly bilingual. He actually got his BA in Pomona College in communications, and then had a very fine and very distinguished career in Mexican cinema, but actually did many in Hollywood films. Here he plays the villain in this typical Western that's, again, the good guy versus the bad guys, and he plays one of the bad guys. In fact, curiously enough, the last film of his career of Pedro Armendáriz was in a James Bond film, From Russia with Love, to just give you an idea of the versatility of Pedro Armendáriz. But this is a typical Western situated on the border. Many other Westerns prior and after this film was made. In the contemporary period, but here continuing to a trend that I mentioned, we have a major star, none other than Oscar winner Jack Nicholson, portraying a border patrol agent, and the film, appropriately enough, is entitled The Border. And the theme of the film here is corruption on the border by American border patrol agents with their counterparts, the Mexican coyotes, as they're called, the smugglers of undocumented workers. And it's a typical action film, a typical film of the hero, again, confronting violence, corruption on the border, and oppression of Mexican undocumented workers, and a predictable end that he, of course, triumphs in the end. And it's got a kind of a very unrealistic scene, but a moving one, that he crosses the river at the end, gives up his work as a border agent and decides to go, or so the film indicates at the end, and have a better life with a Mexican undocumented girl who he saves from the bad guys. The, we have a second category of American films that are much more interesting and actually, shed a great deal of sensitivity and interesting characters and interesting stories about the U.S. Mexican border. And these we would call independent films. What I mean by that is films done outside the confines of the major film studios. And here I wanted to highlight two of the very best of these films. One is Lone Star, directed by John Sayles, a 1996 film, totally set in southern Texas Mexico border, and he deals with a corrupt sheriff um, and an agent that's trying to clean up the border and some residents. But the emphasis of this film, why it's a much more interesting film, is on character development and on border residents. Then one gets a much better sense of what the border experience is all about from these individuals. And you have major stars like Chris Christopherson, Liam Neeson in the film, and it's quite an excellent story of residents in the border facing difficult challenges, but also captivating the border experience and the uniqueness of the border experience through these characters and these situations. And the next film is the latest and most recent film of an independent filmmaker called Frontera, the Border. And it deals with a very tragic circumstance in the Arizona border that some of you might have heard about, where they were actually the Minutemen, as they were called, actually arresting and even killing undocumented workers as they were crossing the border. And the story then follows the lead character played by Ed Harris, who's a rancher in Arizona, and at first is sympathetic to this Minutemen, but then he interacts with a Mexican undocumented worker played by Marco Parks and his wife by Eva Longoria, and begins to realize, the necessity that undocumented workers cross the border, not because of trying to take jobs from Americans, but because they have no options. There's no jobs, there's poverty, there's oppression in Mexico, and they see that their only way out is the border. So it goes through a transformation from being hostile to immigrants to actually being supportive, and even saves the life of Michael Parks when a Minuteman was about to kill him. And so here, again, we have another slice of life and of experience in the border. As usually this tale has not been brought to the screen very often, but here we have Anglo-American characters that turn out to be, the sort of heroes, and shed a very complex but interesting transformation of how they see Mexicanos crossing the border into the Southwest. From that, let's move on because of the time limits to Mexican films. And Mexican films have also a long tradition and a long history of films focusing on the border. In fact, the first Mexican film, curiously enough, was done in 1922, still in the silent period. And it's the first Mexican film about Mexicans in the United States. And it has a very appropriate title entitled El Hombre Sin Patria, the man without a homeland. and he deals with an individual that decides to cross to the United States, seeking the American dream, and only finds heartache and uh, difficulty and discrimination, and at the end returns back to Mexico, which is one theme that Mexican films do carry out in many of their productions. In about the 1940s and early 50s, we have what would be a very unique um, icon in Mexican cinema, and one that captured the border experience like no other in Mexican films. And this Germán Valdez, better known as Tintan, who Carlos Monsiváis, um, Mexico's greatest um, cultural critic and essayist, said in one of his early essays that Tintan was the first postmodern Mexican because he used Spanglish. He used many words in English in his constant dialogues, and also brought border culture to greater Mexican audiences in the interior of Mexico. The dress, as you see him, is a pachuco, which made famous later on by Eddie Olmos in Zoot Suit. But here, Tintan was fascinated by the Pachucos because he grew up as a young man in El Paso, Juarez, where most scholars say was the origins of Pachucos. In fact, he was so fascinated by this culture, he made a whirlwind tour of border cities and all the way up to San Francisco, trying to embellish himself and understand Chicanos and Pachucos from their own viewpoints and their own experiences. And he came up with a very creative form of bringing this cultural experience, cultural identity, self-worth that Chicanos dressed in Pachucos style and Mexicans dressed this way were trying to convey, that this was a form of rebellion, of youth rebellion, and also youth self-identity. And Tintan projected this with humor, with great sensitivity, better than any Mexican actor of his time. And we have here in the exposition of the museum a terrific portrait of Tintan, as he's well known with this attire, and who captures Tintan as well as some of the problems that individuals like Tintan faced in a dramatic sort of portrayal of him being gored with arrows. Um, One of the, I would say, the equivalent of border incident of Mexican cinema is a 1955 Mexican film called Espaldas Mojadas, or sort of wetbacks, I guess would be the closest term we could call them in English. And this was it's unique, and it's absolutely splendid in so many ways. Alejandro Galindo is one of the icons of Mexican directors in the golden age. He's known as the sociologist of Mexican films because his films reflected society and society's norms, society's traditions, and he was trying to capture what Mexican society was all about in the 1940s, which the archetypes, what the language, the traditions, the music, and so forth. And he told me, I had the pleasure of interviewing him for this film when I was doing research of my own. And I asked him why he got interested in this. And he said that among his travels, he spent some time in Hollywood. He made a tour of the border himself, and he found the border experience, and he didn't like what other filmmakers were bringing to the border experience, and decided then to write his own screenplay, which he wrote on Espaldas Mojadas, and give a much more sensitive portrayal. What's also unique about Espaldas Mojadas is that the female protagonist is a Chicana, is a Mexican American waitress in El Paso, and there's a wonderful dialogue when they first met, and the hero, the protagonist, says, "Who are you?" And she says, "Maria Consuelo." And he says, "What are you?" And he says, "I'm a pocha." And the protagonist had never heard that term. And pocho was the term, the demeaning term that Mexicans from the interior used on Chicanos who said that they were Americanized and they turned their back on Mexico, and they didn't want anything to do with Mexican traditions and had forgotten their Spanish, which was altogether a very false stereotype. And that's what's one of the things that's unique and outstanding about Espaldas Mojadas, the sensitivity that Alejandro Galindo brought in this film to the border experience. The next interesting film, Mexican film, is El Pocho by Eulalio Gonzalez, known as El Piporro. And he was from Monterrey, so he knew firsthand the border experience, and acted a great deal in the Golden Age films with Pedro Infante, who discovered him in so many words. But later on, he broke into his own cycle of themes that he wanted to convey. And he made two excellent films, one called El Bracero del Año, the undocumented worker of the year, who they have a contest and he wins it. But much more interesting than that film, I wanted to highlight a little bit this film called El Pocho, and it takes place in Juarez and El Paso, and it brings up the identity questions that Chicanos or that Mexican Americans face in the border, because he's very ambivalent about his own identity, and he tries to Americanize himself at one part of the film, and goes into El Paso and tries to negate his Mexican roots, and he has a terrible outing with that. He has an Anglo-American girlfriend, and his brother and his friends beat him up and tell his girlfriend never to be associated with a Mexican and so forth. So he rebels against that, crosses the river, and does the other extreme, then negates his American part and tries to embody himself as a Mexicano, but being he's a border, he's not taken as a real Mexicano as such, and he faces the same experience. So the film ends with a great shot of him jumping into the Rio Grande in El Paso and saying, "This is where we're at. We're neither there nor on the other side, but we're right in the middle." So it does have a very good morality and message to this film. And again, it's another film I would very much recommend to you all. The next film, just to mention, that in the 70s and the 80s, there was a gigantic slew of films done by Mexico on the border, focusing basically on two themes: organized crime and immigration, and not in a very favorable light. And one of the most popular one was this one called Siete en la Mira, by who became the major sort of action star of these films, Mario Almada and his brother Francisco Almada, who always played either the bad guys or the good guys in conflict to the death with this criminal bands in the border. And there were endless amounts of these films that became quite popular in the 70s and 80s, having major stars of Mexican cinema portrayed in a border experience with kind of situations in which you had, of course, the bad guys against the good guys, and always, a sort of happy ending with the good guys winning their battle and making the border again safe and sound for its residents. and the one Mexican film that is highly recommended in contemporary times, and that's probably because the Mexican government invited Chicano director Jesus Salvador Treviño to write and film um, a much more intelligent, a much more important, innovative film on the border experience. And since he was given the green light to write and direct and uh, bring forth the actors that he wanted. That is Jesus Salvador Treviño's film called Raíces de Sangre, a 1978 film. And the story deals with the border in Calexico and Yuma, and it deals with the assembly plants and their exploitive practices of workers on both sides of the border, and how finally the Chicano protagonist, which you see in the first poster, um, join together and unionize for a syndicate and carry out a very successful strike against them. But it also, as subplots, have situations of identity, of immigration, of corruption on the border. But again, a very worthwhile film done, and it's the first sort of co-production that we see of Chicano filmmakers and Mexican cinema. El Jardín de Edén is another film worth mentioning, situated in Tijuana, San Diego border, directed by one of Mexico's leading women filmmakers, Maria Navarro, and she directed this 1994 film, and it's a film that deals with three main characters in the border experience and their experiences and their misadventures in the border, and there's also an Anglo protagonist and how the interaction with them and so forth. It was an interesting experiment in by a very noted filmmaker who is known for films on gender topics, Lola and Danzón, her most famous film with Maria Rojo, and so forth. And this film follows in that trend, and it is one of the few contemporary films done by this generation of filmmakers who was interested in bringing forth border experience, done not in a stereotypic way or exploitive way, but in situations and characters that depict the uniqueness of the border experience. And moving on to Chicano films, I would say that the Chicano filmmakers have been the ones as a whole to bring forth much more sensitive uh, representations of not only the border experience, but border individuals, and comb a much larger breadth of themes on the border, not just immigration, but conflict, historical films, films dealing with music, with comedy, um, and those of the would be the single cinematic genre that I would by far recommend the most for all of you that are interested in border films. One of the first major films on the border is done. It was entitled "The Ballot of Gregorio Cortes," who was a very famous corrido ballad of the border of an individual that is falsely accused of murder. He actually shoots a sheriff in self-defense after the sheriff shoots his brother for no reason, accusing him of a crime which he wasn't the perpetrator. And so, in self-defense, Gregorio Cortes shoots and kills the sheriff and has to flee the infamous Texas Rangers. And he outwits them for many, many months. And throughout Texas, there was a huge campaign against him and his exploits in um, eluding this massive this massive hunt for Gregorio Cortes made him a local hero to the Chicano community and made this ballad very well known. So the director Robert Young and the producer Moctezuma Esparza hired James Edward Olmos to be the protagonist, and they filmed this excellent um, movie about the border experience and Gregorio Cortes, and again the exploitation um, and the violence against Mexican origin population in the turn of the century. A more recent film and the debut of the outstanding director Gregory Nava was in 1983, a very pioneer movie of the border experience. And why I say that it was pioneer is because, as you know, when now we talk about Central American immigration constantly, and that is, you know, the major crisis facing the border today. But yet in 1983, hardly anybody was talking about Central American immigration. It was all Mexican immigration. For that reason, Gregory Nava decided to focus on Central American immigrants. And the Norte is divided into three segments by these two immigrants, a sister and a brother from Guatemala, all the way to Los Angeles. And it is one of the most accomplished films on not only the northern border, but the southern border experience. And here we have a much more lighthearted view of the border, a 1987 film written, directed, produced, and starring Cheech Marin, which gives you a different take on the border. He uses comedy as social satire. He's a Chicano that gets deported by his looks and doesn't have his ID when he's rounded up in a raid, immigration raid, and he's deported to Tijuana, and he doesn't speak a word of Spanish. And so you get a very different take. But again, it's a satire of all of these institutions, the Immigration Department, the Department of Social Security, the Department of Welfare, and so forth, that are mistreating undocumented and border people. And this is one of the most interesting border films, again, directed by Chicano filmmaker Isaac Arsenstein, 1988. It's a true story. Pedro J. Gonzalez, who became the first celebrity in commercial radio in the United States, singing in Spanish and becoming a civil rights leader in the community, who immigrates from Mexico, fleeing the Mexican Revolution, and his music is all about the border, and he composed half of the songs that he sung. And here's an illustration that La Voz de Mexico en la Frontera is how important radio was in those years of the 30s, the 20s, the 30s, and 40s in throughout the border. And Pedro J. Gonzalez was one of the major protagonists and celebrities in this trend. And of course, I'll conclude my formal presentation of the film Selena, which, although Selena was from Corpus Christi, not exactly on the border, but as we all know, she was the queen of what is called Tex-Mex music, that is music along the border. And of course, you know, she gave many concerts in Mexico, in Monterrey, in El Paso, everywhere. And she became equally iconic and famous and noteworthy on both sides of the border. And you know, her death at the age of 23, when she was at the height of his popularity, was just one of the greatest tragedies, you know, of the border experience, and so forth. So we can conclude by saying that film has been one of the most important and one of the most constant artistic representations of the U.S.-Mexican border, that captures and deals with endless amounts of single type aspects of the border experience, the lifestyle, the traditions, the music, and characters, both historical, both real life, and fictional characters. So I would just end this part by mentioning to watch, or clamoring for you all that are interested in the border to check out these border films. You'll not only enjoy them, but you will learn a great deal from them that is not as easily found in other artistic or academic studies.
Yeah, so now I'm going to be taking questions from the audience, both and here on Zoom. So first question from Javier Morin is, do you have a compiled list of the films that you outlined today?
Well, I don't have a list per se. I do have some publications that mention a number of border films. I would point to a little book that I did a while back entitled El Norte, the U.S. Border in Contemporary Cinema, that lists numerous border films, both from Mexico and from the United States and from Chicano cinema. I would also say that there are other publications like Rosalinda Fregoso's book, The Bronze Screen, that has, a good deal of titles. There's also an anthology by Cho Noriega entitled Chicanos in Film, that has a great deal, of titles and essays that touch upon the border. And then there's some Mexican scholars that have done some excellent work compiling and analyzing and giving synopsis of border films. The leading Mexican scholar on border films is Norma Iglesias, who is a professor at San Diego State University, and has published a 2-volume work on Mexican films. And then one other source that I would cite is by Emilio Garcia Riera, who was one of the main film historians of Mexico. Published a 4-volume series called México Visto por el Cine Extranjero, Mexico Viewed by Foreign Cinema, and has aspects of all kinds of films that deal with Mexico and deal with the border, from American cinema and even European cinema. Later on, I would be happy to correspond with anybody that might have further questions, or might want to have further information about either a filmmaker or a film per se, or any aspects related to this presentation.
I just put the links for the books, 2 of the books that you mentioned. If there's any more that people would like, I put Norte, U.S. Mexican Border Contemporary Cinema link if you want to purchase the book, as well as México Visto por Cine Extranjero. Another question, how has film promoted social justice?
That's a good question. I would say in a number of ways. A number of the films that focus on immigration, mostly independent ones, do talk about the injustices against undocumented workers by both Mexican institutions and American institutions. And they also talk about individuals that are either working in community organizations, or have been champions, like in the film Raíces de Sangre of the protagonist, or in a film like Break of Dawn, who this celebrity, who once the protagonist gains celebrity status, speaks out against injustices. And in the time of the Great Deportation in the 1930s, which was an incredibly hostile period for Mexicans in the United States as a whole. So we have that, and then we have films, again, like El Norte, that do talk of the tribulations that Mexicans face in this country, or Alambrista, that is another wonderful, wonderful film. I think Alambrista actually um, gets into the interior world of a undocumented worker better than any film that I've ever seen. Um, so number of films do touch upon social justice and bring forth to give a wider audiences a view that's not highlighted by the media or by the press or politicians about undocumented workers and also their contributions to our economy in the United States.
Could you talk about Chicano documentaries? And yeah, that's it. Could you talk about Chicano documentaries maybe from today?
Yeah, the amount and the creativity of Chicano documentaries are really exceptional, exceptional. Uh, we have all the way from, the first Chicano documentaries done in the early 1960s, all the way to the very present, and we have Chicano documentarians from throughout the United States, as far as Chicago, as far as Laredo, Texas, El Paso, San Francisco, obviously Los Angeles, and I would say there are now close to 100 Chicano documentaries that have been produced and exhibited in the United States and in Mexico, and many film festivals abroad. Some very prize-worthy documentaries. Many of them, touching upon the border experience, and uh, again with a great deal of variety of themes and creativity, historical ones like the hunt for Pancho Villa, to ones focusing on gender and identity like Las Martas, by Cristina Ibarra, um, uh, done in 2014, um, and films on the U.S.-Mexican border like Neighbors, U.S.-Mexican relations, um, and Yo Soy Chicano, which does a whole odyssey of the Chicano experience going through the border and into the United States. Um, and uh, I the Ballot of an Unsung Hero, which is a documentary on Pedro J. Gonzalez that later was done into a feature film, the Ballot, the Break of Dawn. But many films like another documentary, Chicano documentary on the border, the New Tijuana by Paul Espinosa, which talks about the emergence of Tijuana as one of the most important cities on the border from the Mexican side.
Can you talk about Chicano Park? I noticed that you had a slide
Oh, yes.
on Chicano Park. I think that's a very important documentary.
Oh, I'm glad you reminded me of that. Yes, Chicano Park came to be because in San Diego, for those of you that might know San Diego or have been there, um, they decided to construct this huge bridge that would make it easier to go from downtown San Diego to Coronado Beach. Um, Before the bridge, you had to go all the way around um, to get to Coronado. So they built this gigantic bridge, and in building the bridge, they displaced uh, many Chicanos from Logan Heights in San Diego. And in retaliation for this displacement, Chicano artists took these big murals or this big cement pillars and painted murals on them. And they went on and on in painting this, and they became world famous. They got the attention of art critics and writers and newspaper reporters, and it was called Chicano Park. And this is a typical mural of Chicanos there, and it is one of the most I would say, creative art enterprises that Chicanos have done, and it has now become iconic. So much so that I was telling Dr. Vargas about this last night. I have a student that did her senior thesis in Mexico on Chicano Park. She was just so engrossed and so enamored by the murals that they are becoming, not just regional acknowledged, but internationally acknowledged.
Can you speak to Luis Jimenez's piece that we're looking at on the screen?
Sure. Well, I think he encompasses much of the Mexican American experience, both historically and contemporarily, and situated, again with motifs and situations and images that we are so familiar with the border. The first part of that image, of course, is the indigenous roots and the origins, of Mexican society. And then, of course, the second part of that image or that mural is on, low riders and another aspect, another creative artistic aspect of the border experience. So, there are a number of artists that you all have in your incredibly impressive collection that combines, the border experience, which again, sort of goes hand in hand with border films that do the same thing.
I have another question that says, do you feel that some of these films perpetuate the stereotype of Mexican Americans, or do they contribute more to advancing the promotion and validation of Chicano culture?
I would say both. I'd say, unfortunately, the greatest number do focus on stereotypes and fairly negative stereotypes, either as assimilated Mexican Americans or people without certain identity or lost in space, like Octavio Paz's famous book, The Labyrinth of Solitude, in this first horrid chapter called Pachucos and Other Extremes, which he says that Chicanos in Los Angeles, where he did, his research, for so-called research for this book, he said that they are neither here nor there, but sort of lost in this, metaphysical world of, really outrageous insensitivity to the Chicano experience and the border experience. And many, many films on both sides of the border, from both Mexican and North American filmmakers, highlight these kinds of stereotypes. And it is only with independent cinema, as I mentioned, and Chicano cinema, that for the most part are devoid. And Tintan, of course, again, the uniqueness about Tintan is that the humor in Tintan is not done at the expense of border people or Chicanos, but, it's done, in a very sympathetic and a very ingenious and creative form.
What about films like Blood In, Blood Out and Mi Vida Loca? Films like that are a little more mainstream.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's no doubt that there are gangs in Chicano communities, but these films focus just on that as part of the Chicano experience, as if all Chicanos were members of gangs. Both Chicanas, like Mi Vida Loca, or in Blood In or Blood Out, or Boulevard Nights, or these kinds of films that were done with Chicanos, as if that was the only aspect of the Chicano experience. That's my main complaint. Boulevard Nights is not as bad as Blood In and Blood Out, that I find really troublesome. Mi Vida Loca also, just focusing on cholas, as they're called, Chicana equivalent of pachucas. And no doubt, there is something to that in Chicana experience. But there are also like Las Martas, who have nothing to do with Mi Vida Loca, or, a documentary by Nancy de los Sanchos, The Pilsen Experience. We should focus, or we should mention, I don't think we should end our presentation on film without mentioning Hector Gallant, this Chicano documentary, who is just absolutely impressive would be an understatement. His latest documentary called Porvenir is a historical episode of a very tragic event that occurred in South Texas at the turn of the century between 1900 and 1910, when the Texas Rangers were going just bananas in their violence in a massive scale against Mexican origin population. And Hector Gallant does a case study of one small village called El Porvenir, in which these events occurred.
Awesome. Sounds interesting. I'm gonna try to look for it and link it. But yeah, I think once we publish this on YouTube, we'll probably put links of all the films and books that you've mentioned as well. If anyone has any more questions, we'll probably take one last one. Amy Samaripa says, so please you could catch this. Ana Luz Minera Castillo says, muchas felicidades al doctor por su excelente presentación.
If I could just mention a few last words. I just touched the surface on border films. As I mentioned, there are a lot more worthwhile films that I would be happy to share with your audience, or if they do a little research, they could find them. But there are some excellent films that would give you a really enjoyable and illuminating experience of the border.
Very good. I was hoping to have enough time to ask you about Touch of Evil. You and I have talked about Touch of Evil with Orson Welles.
Yeah.
It's a blockbuster film, very innovative, but again, filled with violence and stereotypes, but still exemplary of Hollywood version of the border experience.
It's an important film though, because Orson Welles not only directed the film, stars in the film, uses fabulous camera work to capture the border. But at the same time, as Dr. Vargas was just pointing out, it is full of horrid, negative scenes of border individuals and stereotypes. And one thing that's so difficult for me to accept in Touch of Evil is Charlton Heston playing the part of a Mexican. I mean, the great Ben-Hur star in the El Cid with a mustache playing a Mexicano is just difficult for me to take.
On that note, in closing, Mexic-Arte Museum wants to thank all the viewers who have tuned in to see the virtual lecture series. Each of the lectures can be enjoyed on YouTube. If you haven't viewed the current exhibition, Mexico, the Border and Beyond, plan to visit the museum soon. The museum offers free admission on Sundays. And on that note, we bid you goodbye. Adios.
Adios. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you all. Have a good weekend. Goodbye.